Welcome to House Einstein Podcast 24. We are tentatively titling this Realtors Fought the Law and the Law Won. I am Osman with House Einstein. I am the founder of House Einstein. I'm a realtor here in Boulder, Colorado. And with me is Hamish Crabb.
Hello.
We are running a little behind on publications of the podcast. So today is November 7th. It'll probably be at least 2 weeks before you hear this, but we're going to try to accelerate our podcast publication schedules to catch up. Because I've been away for a few weeks. I was in India, and that was a trip that I had been planning for a long time. And maybe at some point I'll talk about that trip in more detail, but I was away for a couple of weeks and now I'm back working remotely while I was gone, but obviously not on the ground to do showings. And thankfully Hamish was able to cover as well as cover listing appointments. So thanks for doing that, Hamish.
Yeah, of course. It's we'll actually get into that later on in the podcast, but it's just part of our service, isn't it?
That is. And Hamish, do you want to say anything about your
Constant
background
coverage.
And your role?
Yeah, I've been with House Einstein coming on 21 months now. Initially came on as a marketing coordinator and since then have really become a jack of all trades, assisting from contract showings, of course, marketing, and then implementing business development systems and keeping the boat afloat. So
Absolutely.
Great to be
here. Supporting all three agents on the team.
Yeah.
And at some point we may have more agents on the team, but right now we are at 3 agents and quite happy working together. Quick disclaimer I want to add here that this podcast is purely entertainment. It is not intended as legal advice, real estate advice, financial advice, or spiritual advice. It is entertainment. And if you are a client of our company, please contact your House Einstein agent when you would like advice. Contact them via email, contact them via phone, send out a smoke signal, whatever you're doing to be in touch with your agent. Please rely on your agent for real estate advice, not a podcast that is intended to be informative, but must be treated as entertainment for legal purposes.
And is also very much generalized. We can't be as bespoke as we could if it was a one-on-one situation.
That's correct. As well as the fact that what we're talking about is primarily the case in the state of Colorado where we are licensed, and licensing is in the real estate profession is regulated at the state level and practiced at the state level. And what you do in California or Texas or New York may not be applicable. The situations could be different and the responsibilities of your agent could be radically different than what we do here in Colorado. Okay, so with that said, if you're looking to learn more about us, you can find us at houseeinstein.com. And let's jump into the topics.
Yes.
Before we really get started, I want to touch base about what's going on in the world. It's really hard to ignore the giant elephant in the room, the war that's happening in Israel and in Gaza. And it is obviously that's not our focus. There's thousands of other people there's many other people that are more knowledgeable than us. And you can get your opinions from them, but not saying anything about this feels really wrong too. So we're going to touch base on that, or at least I'm going to talk a little bit about that briefly. And then we're going to jump into the topic du jour for this podcast, which is the NAR lawsuit, the National Association of Realtors lawsuit. We'll cover some of the basics for the background of that lawsuit, for how commissions work and what was decided and how it's likely going to impact the real estate profession, at least from my perspective. We'll talk about a big decision I've recently made regarding our listings and our approach to listings. And then that should be enough for this particular podcast. Typically, our podcasts are about an hour long. We certainly can talk for a lot longer, but an hour seems to be a nice, juicy, and reasonable chunk of time. Some of my favorite podcasts go on for 3 hours, and I just think that's too much for any podcast.
Can you make it through them?
I do. I listen to them when I'm gardening or working on a car or working out or commuting. I listen to podcasts a lot when I'm commuting. Maybe it makes sense when we do interviews, and we will do some interviews, more interviews. We've done some in the past, but we'll do more interviews in the future. Maybe it makes sense to go longer, but for a weekly podcast that's related to real estate and topics in real estate, it makes sense to try to keep it to an hour.
Absolutely.
Okay. Sound good, Hamish?
Yep. Sounds like a plan.
Anything I'm missing from our topics?
I think you hit the most of it. I've got some questions for when the topics roll around, but I don't want to spoil it. So I think the natural flow of things is going to be the best here.
Okay. And if you're looking for market conditions, by the way, you'll find some of our content to be useful on Instagram. I'm also planning to relaunch the newsletter, which will have market updates. I think we'll do the newsletter monthly going forward. Weekly is just too much. It dies in the summer because I get so busy with clients, and then I pick it up again in the fall and the spring, and then it dies again, and it creates a lot of stress to not be putting out that newsletter. But really, the appropriate publication schedule is probably monthly, and maybe do notable sales as a separate entity. Because we do look at the listings every week, but writing about them takes up so much time. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, before we really get started, I promised a few thoughts on this war. And the reason I want to share those thoughts is mostly because several of my Jewish friends have shared that they feel like the silence coming from their friendship circles is complicity in this event, particularly around October 7th. Now, obviously, it's now a month since this thing began, and sentiments have perhaps changed around that. A lot of people are silent because they don't know what to say. And I grew up, I feel like it's important to say something. And so I'm going to say something briefly and just get to the point. I grew up with a second mother. And how that played out is that when my parents immigrated here, this is the late 60s, early 70s. My dad was in residency, and my mom was home alone, first by herself and then with two kids. Well, one kid at a time and then two kids. And the friends that she made were largely confined to the apartment building in New York City, where I grew up and where my sister grew up. And one of her friends was a detective in the New York City police force, the first female detective. Her name was Edna. And Edna, actually, as it turns out, is cousins with Larry King. Is Larry King still alive? I don't know if he's passed away. But Larry King was her cousin. And she was one of the first, my understanding, is the first female detective in the New York City police force. And she ended up being close friends to my mom. And she also ended up spending a lot of time with me. She taught me my ABCs. I have some very distinct early childhood memories of her. And one of those stories that I heard growing up is that when my parents moved to upstate New York, when I was very young, I missed her so much that I packed a suitcase and wanted to move back to New York City. And she was a lovely influence on my life, and she was part of our family for many years until she passed away. And Edna, of course, the reason I'm bringing this up was Jewish. And throughout my childhood and college, graduate school years, and professional career, I've had many Jewish friends, and now even have Jewish family. And it's something that their pain and suffering around what's going on in Israel is something that I very much am present to and feel incredibly horrible about. And the situation in Israel, sometimes it's hard to separate the Jewish identity from the state of Israel. And that has been a challenging topic, even within my family and friend circles. Like, how do you separate these two things? In any event, what I do want to share is it's just horrific. The actions of Hamas, the government of Palestine, in initiating this war, and now Israel's reaction that was expected. Of course, that would be their reaction. That was what Hamas planned on as a reaction. And now what's going on around the world with protests that are deeply disturbing, and the increase in anti-Semitism as well as hatred towards Palestinians. There's a 6-year-old boy who was killed in the United States. There's an elderly Jewish man that I just read about this week that was killed at a protest, who was bashed over the head with a megaphone by a Palestinian protester. It's bad. And at a minimum, as a company, we can increase our awareness of anti-Semitism and also not get in line to support the U.S. funded bombing and deaths of innocent civilians in Palestine. And it's a complicated issue. Leah and I, my wife and I, just spent 2 hours last night watching documentaries about the Middle East just to educate ourselves on how did we get here. But in any event, this does have a real estate component to it. But before I really get, I guess, too far into that, I do want to express again the compassion that I personally feel, and I know everyone on the team feels, towards civilian deaths, and horrific barbarism towards children, towards non-combatants. It is just deeply disturbing and upsetting, and it's hard to focus on our jobs, particularly in the beginning phases, the first week or two of this war. And I hope it doesn't expand with Hezbollah and Iran and all of the other potential factors that could turn this into a regional conflict. But one thing appears to be probable, and this is where I'll bring it back to real estate, is that as a country, we are funding our national debt at a very high interest rate. The interest cost of our national debt and continued deficit spending is unsustainable when rates go high. And the Federal Reserve made a huge mistake not refinancing our debt when rates were practically zero and refinancing it for longer durations. And now we have a major problem. The Treasury is facing extremely high interest costs, and there are protest votes happening at the national level in the Republican Party primarily. And for the record, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm an independent, since we're talking about politics. But there's a high probability that we're going to see increased military spending. And at the same time, we have to see lower interest cost. And that is inflationary. So I think rates will be coming down faster than expected. But I also think that ultimately, our actions as world police and as a military that has global reach, and the amount of money we spend on the military, as well as the money we need to fund our own country, the interest cost of that will force us to lower rates. And ultimately, we could see rates coming down a little faster than anticipated. Hamish, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's hard to... our industry and over the past year, the major complaint in the loss of the buyer pool has been high rates. And so it's such a tragic effect, I guess, of this global conflict and just everybody's involvement in it, leading to this, I don't even want to call it a silver lining, but of the possibility that, rates may come down. It's all the way around unfortunate. And then at the same, there is that possibility that rates will come down. And yeah, I don't know if I have a point to come in there, but that's a tricky one.
Yeah. I mean, we hope rates come down sooner because it has taken away a lot of purchasing power, particularly from first-time buyers. And I think that that's a more likely scenario. And I do think that prices are probably not going to fall massively in the city of Boulder. They've already come down from the peak, and they've come down in Boulder County. They've come down in Denver, but they haven't dropped materially from the median year over year. So this is one of those things where you have to look at the statistics and you hear two things. You hear prices are up, and that's true. And prices are also down because prices are down from the very peak month of the frenzy, and prices are up from the median of the year. Both of those things are true at the same time. And one thing I want to mention really quick, and I did not mention, is that I also know lots and lots of Muslims, and I grew up in a Muslim household. And even though I'm not religious, I also feel a sensitivity towards what's happening on that front. And particularly when people say, why are there no moderate Muslim voices protesting this war? There's an apostasy problem in this religion. And again, I'm going to reiterate, I'm not religious. But I did want to mention that as well, in case people are saying, wait, hold on, what about quote unquote the other side? And if you really want to have long conversations about this and go deep, I'm happy to have coffee or drinks with any of my clients and friends, and we can go down this topic rabbit hole. But I think I'm going to leave it at that point before before we get even deeper and potentially say things that we really shouldn't be saying because it's not our business. Other than to feel compassion and other than to feel very aware and express concern and be very judicious in not overtly supporting causes that we don't fully understand, and also being careful with being intelligent about increasing awareness of anti-Semitism, because it's on the rise across the world, and it's a long-standing problem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You have something to add, Hamish? You've got an expression
Not
going
necessarily.
on. You want to say something?
I still, the U.S. services debt, right? Or essentially, help me understand this bit a little bit more. We've had extremely high, relatively too. That's another point where you're talking about the median home price down from the peak, but up overall. That we touched on this at another podcast where we look at absolute versus relative data, and the more you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the more whole of a story you get. But a lot of things matter in the relative time frame. An example being, during the pandemic, we had historically low rates. And so relative to that, everything is massively increased. Though it's important to realize that was more of the anomaly than these rates when looking at the bigger picture. My question is, when you have higher rates, you're saying that's a lot of debt to service. Does higher rates not make the country more money, or how does that play into kind of the Fed and the overall?
Okay, great question. And I'll try to cover this without going too deep because it's economics, it's macroeconomics. We live in a global financial system. And after World War II, the U.S. inherited the role of the British, and the world's reserve currency went to the United States. And what that means is that countries that have excess capital, they look to, they purchase U.S. dollars as a reserve, as security, because it's considered the zero risk rate of return, right? The amount of interest that the U.S. pays, the government rate, which is composed of notes and bonds, there's a yield curve, that is considered zero risk historically. Right. Historically, since 1945. And there's more to talk about there. There's Bretton Woods and getting off the gold standard and the dollar floating and becoming a fiat currency. And I'll leave that for the crypto people and YouTube videos on the crypto people. But the US dollar is something that is printed. It is liquidity that is digitally injected or removed. And it is something that our government has control over. And the world reserve currency status gives us a very unique and privileged position. Now, with all of that said, we have been running our country on deficits pretty much ever since we got off the gold standard. We've had a couple of years of having a surplus, but pretty much we're running on deficits. So what does that mean? It's like you're running your household budget and you're spending more money than you are earning as income, and you're putting it on a credit card. And unlike your credit card interest rate, that's probably 20% today because of how high interest rates are, the U.S. government is paying a much, much lower interest rate on the money it borrows. We're borrowing money as a country, and we're borrowing that for short, medium, and long-term durations. And that creates what's called the yield curve. Who's buying that debt and giving us capital? It is all sorts of enterprises. It is other countries, sovereign wealth funds. It is individual investors. It is institutional investors. All sorts of entities purchase U.S. treasuries, notes, short duration notes, and long-term bonds because they need those in their investment portfolios for a variety of reasons. And that's considered zero interest rate risk for them. But as a country, we are paying that interest. But we're paying that interest with money that we're printing effectively. Okay, that's the big picture. So I think does that answer your question about aren't we just paying ourselves? We're not paying ourselves. Right. We're paying the investor's interest.
Somewhat. That makes sense? Yeah, okay. That makes sense, right? To create more cash, we're kind of selling securities or bonds, treasury notes, excuse me.
We are. We're and in the debt world, we call it issuing debt, which sounds way fancier than we're borrowing money. But what that means is we're borrowing money. And one more piece is, well, what's that relationship like for?
That's where I was going. Yeah.
Mortgages, right? So how does that translate to a 30-year fixed rate? It doesn't directly translate. It is related to it. So the U.S. government interest rates on notes and on our treasuries set the base rate for everything else. And for instance, if the U.S. is paying 5% on a 10-year note, what should the equivalent personal loan be? If the government is giving you 5% and it's zero risk, it has to be higher. And so that risk premium is what we as borrowers pay over the government rate. And there's a relationship. It closely tracks the 10-year note, the 30-year fixed rate. But the way that mortgages work is that they're repackaged as securities. It's a process called securitization, and then they're sold. So all the people in your credit class and your income class, for example, there's a rating that's assigned to your loan. From your perspective, that loan on your house is a debt obligation. You have a liability. But for the people that gave you the money to go buy the house you bought a couple of months ago, that's an asset. And those assets are securitized, meaning that they're packaged together in similar risk characteristics. They're sliced into tranches, and they're sold on Wall Street to all sorts of investors. That's in the bond markets. And the reason the reason our interest rates are so low and we have long duration, lower interest rates than much of the rest of the world for loans is because of that secondary market for our mortgages as a country. Okay. And the Federal Reserve has been a buyer of giant packages of those mortgages too, driving the rates down. And there's one more piece that's a little confusing for a lot of people around this, and I'll just finish out on this topic, is there's an inverse relationship between the demand for bonds of all kinds and the rate of return on those bonds. Effectively the annual was called the coupon rate. But basically the more demand there is, the lower the rates go. There's an inverse relationship between the attractiveness of those assets and how high or low the rates go. They float. Okay.
That does.
There's a lot more to this.
I know I could go. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I know more than I should because of my background in the investment world and my MBA and all the work I did. Well, it just makes it hard it's like you ask a question and it makes it really hard because you know too much and you want to just keep explaining. And I think I should stop at that point.
Right. There's the urge to give all the context that you can.
Right. But every year that deficit that the U.S. federal government has gets added on to the national debt. And our national debt just keeps growing and growing. And at this point, I don't have the number in front of me, but the interest cost of our existing national debt is so high, it's insane how much money we just spend on interest every year. But the U.S. has the ability to print money, unlike any other country that if they print money like the U.S. does, would see insane inflation. And we too have seen relatively high inflation, but not Weimar Republic Germany inflation, not Argentina inflation, not Venezuela inflation. Venezuela is what I was thinking about. I think not Argentina. But in any event, we're not seeing that type of crazy, roll a wheelbarrow full of paper dollars around to pay for something because we're the world's reserve currency. So ultimately, though, we can't print forever. And we do have to pay interest on this debt. And so we can't keep rates high because it just keeps adding to our cost. We have to start to lower rates. And the Federal Reserve has control over that at the base level. And my guess is by midsummer, the rates will have materially lowered from where they are now.
All right. You satisfied my questions.
And for all the listeners that just heard that ramble of information, if I got something wrong, feel free to message me. I think I got it right, and I'm sorry it was so lengthy, but it's really hard to be concise when we're talking about the global economic system.
Yeah, it's not a concise system, so it's kind of hand in hand, right?
Well, and there are all these side rabbit holes like cryptos and gold bugs, and you can just there are so many people that talk about this topic in depth. But one thing that it is worth paying attention to as for those that are looking for additional research is look at Ray Dalio's big cycles and the relationship between war and economic cycles. And it does appear that we are headed toward a more warlike period, with our primary adversity being with China. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole that I'm not going to go to.
Yeah, and I mean, we could keep going. But.
Yeah, let's talk about the NAR lawsuit. Okay, I think that would be better. We've talked about the war in Gaza. We've talked about rates and economics. Let's talk about the topic du jour, the NAR lawsuit.
All right.
So, Hamish, do you want to walk through how commissions work? Since you write these contracts, you know how they work.
Yeah, I can give you my surface understanding, right? And we can build context from there. I think makes sense. Real estate's a service industry, and instead of flat rate, real estate's based on a commission of the size of the deal. The sale price of the home typically, in the most, every single time I've seen it on the percentage of the home. The standard, I don't want to say standard, I gotta be, but what I typically see here is when you're writing a listing agreement or when you're crafting anything, you write what the expected commission would be as a percentage of the sale price of the home. And that then in turn is a split between the sell side and the buy side agent. So we see around 6%, 5.6% here in Colorado, and it's usually 2.8 either side or 3 either side. That's about where I understand it to be. I also know it's one of the few industries that actually keeps up with the cost of living almost directly, which is kind of a neat thing, and also quite interesting. I don't know how much more there is that I can say on this, but that's essentially my very surface level of an understanding of it. We've also been, there are listings out there where the split is defined, through the MLS, and it will mention, this is perhaps a discount listing where it's 1.7% to the buy side, or, the seller waives commission. And there's a lot of things where the sell side commission is waived. Excuse me. And there's a lot of room for negotiation in there too, to my understanding. So, Osman, do you want to maybe fill the holes that I've missed here?
All right. Let me jump in. The way commissions are paid today is mostly so the vast majority of deals in the state of Colorado and probably throughout the country, and I would say 98% of deals are paid as a percentage of the purchase price. And the majority of those commissions are paid by the seller to their agent, and their agent, the listing agent, then pays a portion of that to the buy side. And that is how commissions have been done for a very long time. For entirely my career, that's how commissions have been structured. And in theory, as a seller, you can negotiate and you can say, well, I don't want to pay the buy side, or I want to pay less than what you're asking for. And the reality of this industry is that the top agents don't discount very much. And there's a lot of agents that do 1 or 2 or 3 deals a year, and they're not particularly competent. So if you want competent representation, you're going to pay market rate to sell your house. And that agent that you hire will then compensate the buyer. And this lawsuit has said, well, why is it that way? And the National Association of Realtors, that was a defendant, and Berkshire Hathaway, that was a defendant, why are they forcing us as a seller to pay a commission to a buyer that's providing services to somebody, not us? And we don't want to do it. And in theory, at least here in the state of Colorado, you could set commissions to 0 on the buy side and say, we're not paying buyer's agents. If you want to use a buyer's agent, then pay them yourself as a buyer. That's already existed. And nobody's doing that because you would never sell a house. Right. And on the practical level of this, real estate is a very high dollar transaction. Represents a huge percentage of the vast majority of people's investment decisions. Like it's a huge number relative to their net worth, relative to their income, and most people don't feel comfortable going it alone. even when I've represented sellers and there's been an unrepresented buyer appear, they are very uncomfortable working without an agent representing them. So there's that fact. Although they could just say, we don't have an agent. You treat me like a customer. I've done dozens of real estate deals. I don't need an agent. And in which case, if there's nobody to compensate, the contract says the listing agent keeps it or perhaps discounts their commission because there's no buyer's agent to compensate. And that's how we've always done it. If if a buyer shows up and I'm the listing agent, we will drop our commission radically, but not completely in half, because we end up babysitting the buyer. The buyer does need some support throughout the transaction process. They have lots of questions, and we have to take on either a neutral status or we have to take on a status that treats the buyer like a customer. We can't give them incorrect information, but we also aren't advocating for them. We're not helping them with their due diligence. We're not doing the normal things we do when we represent buyers, and that we expect a buyer's agent to go do when they are on the other side of the transaction.
Yeah, customer is the key word here. That's its own defined word in real estate versus
in the state of Colorado
versus in the state of Colorado
versus the casual sense of what's a customer.
Mm-hmm.
Look, we're not talking about booking travel tickets or buying a used car. We're talking about a very high dollar transaction where trust is critical and buyers are unsure and sellers are sometimes unsure too of their legal responsibilities, and people have a desire to limit their liability. And in the state of Colorado, you can be a listing agent, you can be a buyer's agent, you can be a transaction broker, or you can have a customer relationship with the person you're assisting. Those are the four flavors. And that's a whole nother topic where we could talk about for an hour. I don't want to go into too much depth, but basically this lawsuit, the real estate, so the National Association of Realtors lost this lawsuit. Berkshire Hathaway lost this lawsuit. Remax and another brokerage settled prior to it going to jury or prior to the completion. They bailed out and they wrote checks. The lawsuit was for $1.8 billion, and it could treble. It could exceed $5 billion, but it's going to go through an appeals process. It's unclear whether the lawsuit will stand up through the appeals process. It could take 6 months. It could take years to settle out. But immediately upon the announcement of this lawsuit, going against the judgment, going against the National Association of Realtors, additional lawsuits were filed all over the country against other large brokerages like Compass, and so it's going to shake out. And how is it going to shake out? Well, it's not entirely clear. Is the judge going to force agents to no longer offer buy-side commissions? Maybe. That's one possible outcome, where you sign an agreement with a listing agent and the buyer signs an agreement with their agent and the buyer pays their agent directly. That's certainly one possible outcome. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but we'll find out. And as far as we go at House Einstein, we've been nailing the buy-side game for a really long time. That's how I got started in this business. And by nailing it, I mean, we do a lot more than just open doors. We help our buyers with their due diligence. We have a clause in our buyer agency agreement that specifically deals with that. I've always added the investment perspective as well. If clients want to develop spreadsheets and look at dollar per square foot and have discussions over investment performance, I'm qualified to do that. I used to have securities licenses in New York specifically to do that, as well as the analytical training to help people with their investment decisions. So I do that. And we have carve-outs for responsibility, because legally realtors are not supposed to be doing those things. They're not supposed to talk about due diligence. They're not supposed to talk about investment performance. Yet we talk about both of those things in ad nauseum. I can't stop talking about those things. So
I mean, we just had the macroeconomic discussion. So
right, and so we also exactly, and I also specify the commission in my buyer's agency agreement with my buyers, that if the seller's not paying it, you are, but I'll let you know before you write an offer what the commission is, so you're not surprised by any of it. And if you don't buy the house, there's no commission. Mm-hmm. And so we've always asked for the going rate, which here in Colorado is 2.8% currently. Will that drop? Probably. There's a really good chance that's going to drop. I'm not entirely sure. No one really knows how this is going to play out. But I suspect, given how hard real estate has become this past year, and now it will likely become even harder, there's a huge percentage of buyer's agents that are going to be out of business. And let's face it, when people say my agent didn't do anything, they're right. 20 to 40% of agents, I believe, if not more, aren't really earning their commission at all and are relying on the fact that it was established by the seller and the listing agent to be how they're getting the mechanism for them to be paid has been disconnected from their actual performance. And that needs to change. It needs to change in the healthcare industry too, by the way, but that's a whole nother topic, right? Because you walk into a doctor's office, you have no idea what the bill's going to be. And they don't even know. And it's like, okay, great. At least in real estate, you know what the commission's going to be. There's no surprise, but it's going to change. And my perspective is that competition is going to make us stronger. And I've been hammering on this since the NAR lawsuit with my team, is we need to get really good at communicating how we're different, representing both buyers and sellers. Not just different, but radically better. We're transparent. We use systems that work and add value to the transaction, buy side and sell side. We also track metrics. We track the competitive landscape when we represent sellers. We are doing our fiduciary duty and care about fiduciary responsibilities, unlike most agents that don't even understand what that means. And I think we could do a much better job communicating that. And so I'm looking forward to 20 to 40% of these buyer's agents that aren't doing anything getting out of the business because they're not doing anything. They should be out of business. So I think this is going to play out over the course of years, by the way. I don't think it's going to happen in 6 months, but we'll find out. We'll respond, and competition will make us stronger.
So the judge's ruling, it doesn't automatically enact regulation on this, does it?
It's not final yet.
Right.
It has to go through the appeals process. So ultimately, I don't...
So that would set the precedent, though, if the judge ruled, depending on...
So I don't know the specific jurisdiction of their decision and what change one judge can institute nationally. This lawsuit was in the state of Missouri. My understanding it was in federal court. And so judges don't make laws. But clearly things have to change. So likely there's going to be legislation. The NAR, the National Association of Realtors, are one of the largest spenders on lobbying. And likely there's going to be some new laws related to this that protect and favor real estate agents. We'll see. I'm not a legal expert, and I don't know how this is going to play out. I don't know the jurisdiction. I don't know how long the appeals process will occur. But one thing I do know is somebody's going to be writing a check. And we'll write checks to the National Association. We have to be members to be part of the MLS. I have to be a member. I'm in 4 MLSs. They require me to be a member in order to be part of these MLSs. So I'm not getting rid of my membership anytime soon. I'm already writing a check that's almost $1,000 a year just to the National Association. But the agents that belong to Compass, the agents that belong to Berkshire, who do you think is going to pay for this, settlement? Mm-hmm. It's coming out of somebody's pocket.
Something you touched on a little bit earlier as well. It's interesting, the argument that buyer's agents don't do a whole lot, but then you also look at the level of regulation. Buyer's agents can't really do a whole lot because of how restricted they are,
Well, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
And let me come back to that in just a second, because I was hammering on who's paying for this. Mm-hmm. And the answer to who's paying for this are the agents. So commission splits are the expense of being an agent at Berkshire or Compass or Remax or even our brokerage is probably going to go up. So this is going to decrease the take-home pay for real estate agents, which with the average agent doing 3.5 deals per year, we're going to see fewer real estate agents. So that's the full. Let me close out. That's the full circle for why are we going to see fewer real estate agents. Mm-hmm. And as far as the legal restrictions on agents, I get why they're there. Most agents are not qualified to help people with due diligence. Most agents don't understand the mechanisms for how loans work, and they hand that off to the mortgage officer, the loan officer. They don't talk about things because they are afraid of the liability. And the scope of their agreement with the seller or buyer limits what they can actually do. And so They take on massive liability when they walk into a house and they say, oh, look how well maintained this place is. Because if the plumbing breaks the next week, they just talked about how well maintained it was. And it turns out it may not have been. So that's why the lawyers tell agents to not talk about those things.
Right. It's kind of a hands tied situation.
Right.
Right.
And as far as negotiation goes, one of the disconnects, so that's the third piece, right? Negotiate an amazing deal, help your client do their thorough due diligence, and then if something comes up during that due diligence process, guide the client through exiting the contract. If you're on the buy side, guide them to exiting the contract and getting their earnest money back. Protect their earnest money and encourage them to do their due diligence. And the third piece was negotiate aggressively. And in the last 5 years, 7 years, that has just meant getting them a seat at a bidding table for the most desirable properties. But right now, that's changed. We're seeing massive amounts of new inventory. Only about 20%, just under 20% of brand new listings in October went under contract in Boulder County, above $1 million. The market is slowing and hitting the brakes hard, and sellers are adjusting pricing. And it's fourth quarter. This is the time to negotiate those killer deals for buyers. And that's what you're paying for, is somebody to help guide you through that process and slice through the smoke and mirrors and nonsense that a listing agent is likely to throw at a buyer to influence them psychologically. That's why, another reason why you hire an agent.
Do you think the buy-side commission coming out of the seller's proceeds, my understanding with that as well is it also helped reduce the amount of financial incentive for a buy-side agent to just get somebody in a home?
I think it increases the
when it comes from the sell side versus the buy side.
Yeah.
I mean,
because you're getting paid 2.8% on the buy side to push your client to go buy this house. So it takes someone of exceptional integrity to ignore that compensation and do the right thing for their client, the buyer. And I don't think most agents do that. I think that they are cheerleaders and aren't doing a great job in advocating and advising. That's my personal experience with the vast majority of buy-side agents. We're not like that because we're driven by ethics and principles in our company, as we talk about them constantly. I don't think that's the reality for most people. So when the compensation is coming from the seller, and it's disconnected from the performance of the buyer's agent, then they're going to get poor service.
There's an opening there, right, for far less integrity.
Compensation should be aligned with performance incentives, right? In theory, if you could wave a magic wand and say, how should buyers agents be paid? They should be paid by negotiating a better deal, conducting more thorough due diligence, being experts in the contract and making sure they protect their buyers' earnest money, and advising them on homes that are not worth buying at all, and showing them problems when they walk in the door that they may not have considered, that we do routinely. But there's a huge disconnect between the work we actually do and how we get paid. And so that's why I've often said, terminating a deal, and you've heard me say this to the team, you terminated a deal for your buyer, that's a success.
Yeah.
We're not getting paid for it, but we did our job. And that sort of disconnect between performance and incentives, I would love to wave a magic wand and erase. The problem is that you're not going to get somebody that's performing at this level unless there's a high degree of compensation. It's not going to happen.
How would you compensate for it otherwise?
Right. Are you going to guarantee me 2.8% whether or not you buy a house? Are you going to pay that up front and put it into an escrow account? And in 180 days, I'm paid that either way, whatever the average price of the homes we're looking at? Not going to happen. I mean, I've suggested it to people. Like, if you're so worried about this disconnect that you want to come up with a unique compensation structure, I'm all ears,
right,
on how this works, because I don't like it when I'm doing my job and killing it at my job, but we don't close because I did my job, and guess what? I didn't get paid. That doesn't make any sense. So nobody's ever taken me up on it, by the way.
Yeah. And
every time I brought up alternatives, every time to the buy side, they're like, it's okay. Let's just stick with the standard how this works. We don't need to rock the boat. We don't need to change anything. I'm not going to pay a commission up front. Although I've had one buyer offer to, because we went 3 years and he offered to just pay the commission.
Did they close last year?
Charles.
Oh, okay.
No, this is Charles. Years ago. Our friend and advisor and friend, Charles.
I was thinking Tyler, but
yeah, let's not mention names any further.
Okay.
It's a small town. But yeah. No, they offered to pay. Because we'd done our job, and he recognized that. And I said, no, that's not how we get paid. We get paid as a success fee.
So this lawsuit it's antitrust, right? Being that the idea is because of the way the system has been, it incentivizes higher commissions or higher sale prices.
I think it's antitrust because all major brokerages are doing the same thing, which if you go from Remax to Coldwell Banker to Compass to any brokerage in town, the commissions are all going to be very similar. You're not going to see a major difference between any of the agents, especially the top performing agents. And as I've often told my clients, I'm not crazy about this, but if you have another agent approach you with a discounted commission and they're a competent, high performing agent, I'll match their discounted commission. Because I compete. I'm not going to ignore competition. Show me who they are. Show me the listing agreement or buy-side agreement that has a lower commission in it, and I'm happy to match their terms because we will adjust. If the average commissions to buy-side agents go from 2.8 to 2% in the next 3 years, we will be forced to adjust. But we're going to emphasize how much more work we do up front, and maybe we have to reframe or configure our menu of services to our buyers. And that's fine. We'll do that. But for now, the commissions are the same. And in 6 months, it could be a radically different world.
And also looking at the commission structure, one thing since I've been here is we've constantly looked at ways to continue to increase our service on the buy side and make ourselves more and more competitive. It's never been, that's just how it goes. It's always been like, what can we do to further support our buyers? How can we make life easier for them? And also, out of state, we touch on so often because I'm really kind of proud of what we do, is we really, really try to disclose as much possible as we can when we're doing.
Well, we do that for in-state too, but out of state, the reload.
Yeah, I just mean reload.
The reload people that can't be here on the ground looking at listings every weekend, our systems to serve them with remote videography. And many of these videos are an hour long, going through the house, showing what's right and what's wrong. I don't know of any other agent doing that with gimbaled cameras, microphones, really high quality. Often we're putting drones up in the air, all of that to not sell it, to show them what's right and what's wrong. And that's a strange service when you think about it, but it's the only way to really help these reload people. At least 2 times a year, maybe 3 times, we're closing deals from people that first saw the house online, second saw the house with our video, flew in just after we put it under contract for inspections, and almost all of them closed because I go overboard on telling them everything wrong with it. Because I don't want them flying in here and wasting all this time if there's something visible and obvious that we could have pointed out.
And it's good
that one
feeling.
listing just recently, it literally saw the house had termite damage. And I have never seen that personally in Colorado, but that's what it looked like. And there was obvious mold issues in the basement. And they had actually toured the house in person and were prior to asking us to go look at it on video because they were here just for a week and they went with a different agent. And of course, there was a lot of sales talk, happy talk about how amazing the location was. And I get there and I'm like, okay, the location is in a swampy bucket. You can see the mold growing on the outside of the walls and the moss all over the place. And then you get in the basement and the dark room that is of no value was not properly mitigated during the flood. You could see the mold growing on the footboards. And then the exposed studs in the basement, one of them clearly shows signs of some sort of insect has destroyed the stud.
Hey.
I know what it looks like because I worked on Nantucket. That looked like powder post beetle or termite damage. I don't know what insect it is, but something has been eating the hell out of the stud.
Yeah. And it's actually a very nice feeling to be able to we go and we film these homes, and it's nice not having, because we don't do this as a brokerage, it's nice not having the pressure to just only mention the good things of a home. And more often than not, because we come in with that mindset, you're at the end of the house doing your wrap up and you're like, so good things. You're kind of, because your mindset was so focused on, maybe some functional issues or, insect damage or mold or, the myriad of different things it could be. And the goal, I think, that we're doing all this for is disclosure. We want the buyers to be as informed as possible, know what you're getting into. And while we're limited in our abilities, we can recommend who you should talk to, the professionals in the industry.
Well, I would say it's advisory. It's not just disclosure. Yeah. It's, we want them to see everything right and wrong and then make an intelligent decision. And sometimes we disagree. Like the same client, we went down an analytical rabbit hole on a listing in Spring Valley. And that listing appeared to be slightly overpriced, but they felt it was radically overpriced. And I was like, well, Spring Valley's west of Broadway. It's a unique subset. It's not Wonderland Lake and it's not Newlands. And it's not the Calmia kind of corridor of east-west streets that there's maybe 50 houses in that pocket that trade at really high values. It's its own unique little thing. Is it overpriced? That listing was overpriced, but not as high as they felt it was overpriced. But we disagreed, and that's okay. Their baseline was a different market, still is a different market, where homes in that price range should be completely buttoned up, no issues at all. And this particular house at $3.5 million had a bunch of deferred maintenance, right? Like a bunch of wood floors that didn't match and a whole bunch of other things that are just silly, right? Like this would cost a few $1,000 and you're selling a $3.5 million house, refinish every floor in the house if it's been on market this long. So I get where they're coming from. And we also, our job is not to tell them they're wrong.
Right.
We can disagree, and that's fine.
Help them make a smarter real estate decision, truthfully,
Well, I mean, and even ultimately disagreeing with them about the price value, they're signing a buyer agency and they're on board with us. So we also recommend, by the way, if you're thinking about working with a buyer's agent, to go test drive them. Go look at some houses together and then ask yourself if you can trust this person.
Your analogies are always really good here.
If they really want you to write an offer on every house and they're super selling it, you don't have a buyer's agent. You have a shill. Mm-hmm. You have somebody selling you just like the listing agent would on this house. And this will, let me segue to the last piece because there is a tie-in here. And we turned down a listing last spring that we came very close to listing. I think I had even prepped a listing agreement. Like we had met multiple meetings with this person, and the house, super dated, but very large lot and sitting on 100-year flood zone property, but the views were incredible. So,
and protected.
If you're going to buy a home,
relatively protected. The views were relatively protected too.
Probably because of the park in front of it, and that's don't share anything else because I don't want to embarrass the agents involved. We work with these people every day, but we turned down that listing because the seller was very insistent on a very high price and had previously tainted the market with amateur marketing and throughout the neighborhood, flyers throughout the neighborhood, all sorts of nonsense, and had made our job harder. And it was becoming very clear that we weren't able to communicate very well. And even though we might have started with a high list price, they weren't willing to do the work in terms of staging the home. And they wanted to ignore this 100-year flood problem. And it just felt like a bit disrespectful. The level of, we know everything, and yet why are they hiring us? And then the last piece was he was pushing on commissions. And I'm like, okay, there's other agents that'll take this. Go for it. We're good. And they went with another agent and they wasted 4 months on market. And then they took it off and brought it back. And they now professionally staged it with a different agent, priced it $500,000 lower. So now we're in realistic pricing, and they staged it. And they got lucky with a buyer's agent that pushed the client to buy it. And I hope that buyer's agent, who has a reputation for being really salesy, I hope that agent warned their client about the limitations of the 100-year flood, about how that restricts building permits and radically increases the cost of construction and radically increases insurance costs. I hope that she disclosed all that and advised them that you're going to take on a more challenging build to change this 90s era house because of this. It's not that it can't be done. The St. Julian is sitting in a 100-year flood, but we're talking about a much, much bigger budget to get done what you want to get done because it's in the 100-year flood. And by the way, and this I'll be adding to every meeting I have with people looking at homes in the 100-year or 500-year flood, the FEMA flood parcels are conservative and politically influenced. So what that means is that you're better off not buying anything that's even close to the 500-year flood because it's conservative the wrong way, meaning it should be more expansive flood zones, not less expansive flood zones. So This brings me to the last thing I want to talk about, and that's a decision I've made, is that if I can't look myself in the mirror and say, I would advise a buyer to consider buying this home because of these factors and this price, here's why this home makes a lot of sense. I'm excited about it. I'm not going to take the listing. If the home has a seller not willing to address massive deferred maintenance, bad communication, home is radically overpriced, we're just going to say no thank you. Even though I know that 3 months, 4 months down the road, they're going to start dropping that price pretty aggressively. They're probably going to stay with the horse that they signed up for in the beginning. I don't think it's right to overprice listings. I don't think it's right to list homes that you ethically don't think a buyer should buy. And so I'm not going to list those homes any longer. I think it's a hard decision, a hard no, based on not how much money I make, but the ability to look at myself in the mirror and live in line with my ethics and principles.
Yeah. And I think that's a strong argument for what we're doing, right? What the principles of the brokerage.
The principles of our business, the principles and ethics that we individually have as humans. I will admit that this wasn't always the case, okay? Sometimes you have to learn the hard way. Right after college, I knew I didn't want to work in an office at the time. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And for a very brief period, I worked in sales with this company out of Albany, New York. I think they were called Horizon Foods. And they sold flash frozen meat products, fish, chicken, beef, pork. And it was frozen and vacuum sealed. And they set you up with a truck, Hamish.
This is from the talking point. This is that story?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I've been waiting
out
on
of a
one.
truck story. I know.
Okay.
So basically, imagine that you just graduated from school. You need a job. They pay you a base salary plus commissions. And the base salary was really low, like $20,000 a year. But you had the opportunity to make a lot more money if you sold the meat out of the truck. And you would take this little truck and you would drive around neighborhoods. And it had a box freezer on the back. And you'd knock on the door and you'd lie. And you'd say, hey, I just happen to be making deliveries in the neighborhood and I've got some extra meat. I'm willing to give a really good discount on it if you'd like to see it. And you would show them the high quality product, flash frozen, much tastier. And it was actually not a hard sell. But here was the problem for me personally. One, this felt very disingenuous.
You weren't just driving through the neighborhood.
You're lying completely. And you're going door to door and ringing doorbells, which is not a great way to build a scalable business. But I was 20 something. So let's let that go for a second. The bigger problem was I had been a vegetarian for about 7 years at this point. And I had been a vegetarian. Why I was a vegetarian is a whole nother story.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's because it's like, are you vegetarian ethically or are you vegetarian diet preference? Because there's that whole side of things too, right?
I was vegetarian. I started being vegetarian because I was trying to date this girl who was a vegetarian. And I thought, let me try it. And it was actually pretty easy to be a vegetarian. I was a bad vegetarian, though. I'll add that. It was a lot of pasta, a lot of bread, a lot of carbs. But I was a vegetarian, and I had not had meat in my body for many years at this point. And after 3 weeks or 2 weeks of going door to door, selling meat out of a truck, which I was successful at, I just couldn't live with this anymore. I'm like, I'm lying from the moment I start the conversation to the moment I end it about how tasty and good this meat is. And I've never even had it.
Yeah.
And the reason I've never had it is because I don't believe in eating meat at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward many years later through grad school, I'd been living on Nantucket, and Nantucket in the winter, there was only like 2 restaurants open, and our friends group would have chicken wings every Wednesday night. And after like a month or so of chicken wings I was having like the celery and the carrots and a salad. And I finally like, let me just have one wing. And it was like game over. As soon as my body tasted that protein, I was
from
like,
the first start.
What was I? So I went 9 years as a vegetarian total. But this rule for listings is is the don't sell meat out of a truck as a vegetarian rule.
Yeah.
When you can't ethically believe in the listing, you don't think it's a good home to buy, maybe at any price, but particularly at the price the seller wants to sell it at, don't take the listing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a conflict of ethics and integrity.
Yeah. I have back to the NAR suit. Is that worth circling around
let's
to?
Let's go back. What's your question?
So we mentioned that there's likely going to be a huge drop in agents, probably in general, not just buy-side agents. And we've also mentioned that there's going to be a drop in commission. And I could see this being an incentive for a lot of agents to take on the quantity has a quality of its own principle, which to me seems like it has also the potential to increase. I'm blanking the word, but essentially you get less service, right? Because you have an agent that's intentionally trying to get as many deals as they can, whether or not they can support them all, just to kind of make up for a commission difference. And so there
could be new service models too. Mm-hmm. There could be people that are unlicensed that just run around showing homes. And it's $50 a house, and you just go drive around with somebody and go look at a few houses. But this person can't talk about the contract. This person can't provide you with comps. This person is not advocating for you at all. They're just a glorified door opener, and maybe it's $50 a house or $100 a house. Who knows? Personally, I would never let that service into my listings because this is also potentially a criminal. And this person doesn't know their buyer at all. And I've had that experience in some of our listings when Redfin and Zillow were getting a lot of success with the click a button, schedule a showing. And you would get people that didn't know the neighborhoods, weren't even from the town, had no idea what they were talking about showing the home.
Yeah, and just got their license.
Well, they usually are very inexperienced, and they also just met the client. They literally meet the client in front of the house for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I need, this increases the workload for the listing agent, by the way. And that's when I realized, and this is something we're now doing with all of our listings, is I need to be present at these showings as much as possible. And if I can't be present, you, Hamish, need to be there, because the agent that's showing the house could be one of these Redfin or Zillow agents that have no clue what they're doing, don't know anything about the neighborhood, just got their license, maybe just moved to Colorado, and don't know their client at all. And we need to be able to sell the house, its positive features, why this price makes sense.
And also answer, and some of the feedback we've gotten over the past few months, they're easily answerable questions, and also questions that would have quelled a potential buyer's concerns. And just being an agent on site and knowing those things is also, a huge advantage.
Well, not just knowing it, but advocating for it. Mm-hmm. Because if you follow the no meat out of a truck rule, you're selling something you believe in. Yeah. And that energy of knowing this house is worth what the list price is, knowing how much better it is and why it's better. You can talk intelligently about the competition and be like, well, this house on Main Street, yeah, it's priced lower, but it's got one less bathroom and a one-car garage. It's also across the firehouse. Have you hung out there for a little while and heard the fire trucks go? It's not fun.
Your
it's also on a busier street. This home's on a quieter street, has better views, is better insulated. The mechanicals are newer. Like, you can talk about those things and have very positive, upbeat energy. And I've seen this with my own clients where they're like falling in love with the listing agent who's really cute and really upbeat and bubbly. And I'm like, the house is a dump. Like, we're walking out the door and they're like in love with the house. And I'm like, you're not in love with the house. You're in love with this agent who's all positive and charming and attractive. I can't compete on pretty, but I can compete on positive energy if I believe in the listing itself. If I don't believe in the listing, you can't sell what you don't believe in, not effectively anyway. So I think one thing that could happen is listing agents could charge more. If they're going to do every showing like we're now doing, we could bump the commissions on the listing side. Mm-hmm. At this point, I think we're actually getting, me personally, I'm getting more listings than buyers at the moment. So I'm fine with that. Cutting buy-side commissions. I don't think it's going to have an impact at all on my personal income, but it does have an impact on how this business works, and we're going to see.
Yeah, time will tell. It's already been set in motion. This is, would you call it like a kind of watershed suit, landmark suit type of
It is a landmark and watershed
Yeah.
suit, but the impacts won't be felt for, I think, at least 6 months. But we'll find out. No
Mm-hmm.
one really knows. The NAR is going to mount a vigorous defense of the existing legacy system, and we're going to find out how this plays out. But in the meantime, if you're thinking about buying or selling, well, you can hear all the questions you should be asking the person you're thinking about hiring. And those questions are: tell me about what you know about houses. Tell me about what you know about the neighborhoods. Tell me about your approach to representing me as a buyer. And we've defined it really quickly: selection, negotiation, due diligence support, advocacy throughout the transaction representing the buy side, and also remote videography with those same principles in mind if you're a relo client.
Mm-hmm.
That's like our bread and butter. We know those systems, and I don't think anybody I know of locally competes with that. At least I have yet to see them showing up with a camera and
Yeah.
spending an hour in the house going through what's right and what's wrong.
I see like a FaceTime call, but at that point, you're more focused on the call quality and making sure you have the right angle versus when we're able to go in just ourselves with the camera handheld. We can be far more detailed than seeing an agent trying to FaceTime their client and show around at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Having the person live on the call is a detriment. You're
Mm-hmm.
totally distracted by your interaction with the person, and it's hard to point out what's right and what's wrong, even if you're on a gimbaled camera. Cell phones, even the nicest cell phones, is not a very high quality image.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that image is instantly being uploaded, so the compression really kills the detail.
Mm-hmm. That too. So, okie dokie.
You think we're done?
I don't know. I'm looking at the
done with
talking points. I
podcast
think we're
24?
doing fairly okay.
Well, realtors fought the law and the law won, at least for now. And we've talked a little bit about the war in Israel and Gaza. We've talked about this NAR lawsuit, fighting the law. We've talked about a business decision, a principle that is added to my list of principles when it comes to business decisions, and that is to not take listings that we can't feel good about selling, that we don't believe. If we don't believe in the listing, we should not take it. And that is it, I think, for podcast 24. So to wrap this up, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Osman with House Einstein. You can find us at houseeinstein.com. Hamish and I work very closely together
every day.
And our mission is to help you make a smarter real estate decision. Thanks again for listening to us, and we'll catch you next time.